Okay, welcome to this conversation on borders and solidarity in the times of Corona. This is an in-context event organized by the Center for Humanities and Social Change, Berlin. My name is Robin Celikates. I'm teaching philosophy at the Free University here in Berlin, and I'm the deputy director of the center. Due to the pandemic, our program has, of course, moved online for a large part, but I'm very glad that we can have today's conversation face-to-face, albeit, of course, at the required distance. A warm welcome to our two guests, Manuela Bojadžijev, who is an anthropologist and migration scholar, deputy director of the Berlin Institute for Integration and Migration Research, and a professor of anthropology. And a warm welcome to Muhammad al-Kashef, who is a researcher and activist and who is engaged in the incredibly important Watch the Mad alarm phone project, about which I hope we will hear a bit more in the course of the conversation. I'm very excited that both of you were able to join us here today for this event, and we will make the event available online in a few days. Now, while the coronavirus pandemic in a way affects all of us, recent developments have, of course, made it very clear that not all are affected equally. Both the spread and the impact of the pandemic are profoundly mediated by social and political inequalities that structure societies along the lines of class, gender, and race. This is true within countries, be it in the US or in Germany, but it's also true across countries, and these inequalities are very clearly upheld, reproduced, and intensified by the international border regime. The current pandemic has obscured the plight of refugees around the world as much as it has exacerbated their situation. Refugee camps at the borders of the EU and elsewhere have become the crucible of this crisis just as much as they condense the structural violence of the border regime more generally. While campaigns such as Leave No One Behind have mobilized some public attention, the catastrophic effects of the pandemic continue to be especially harsh at the border in a form that is intensified by the border. At the center, we are very interested in how these different aspects of the crisis hang together and how they, let's say, are embedded in broader crisis tendencies that affect both capitalism and democracy as, let's say, structural features of the societies we live in. Now, I would like to start our conversation today with a rather general question, namely, what does the crisis, as we currently experience it, the crisis that is tied to this pandemic, what does it make visible and what does it obscure with regard to the situation of refugees and the operation of the border regime? Kashef, I would like to invite you to make a first, to present the first answer to this question.
Thanks for this introduction and thank you for inviting me.
When we look at it, the closing the borders, not just in front of the migrants and refugees, but in front of all non-European citizens, and even there is different countries took highly measure of closing for certain nationalities and for certain people coming from certain regions in the world, and how the states and different governments actually took an advantage of the situation of corona pandemic and make it a kind of a legitimate excuse to close the borders. And when we take from the scope of migrants and refugees and how it affected them, if we look, for example, in Greece, we will find just right before the closure and the lockdown, Turkey opened the borders for a few days and everything came intense in islands and hotspots.
And when we look, for example, for Moria and Lesbos, it's an obvious example for the recent EU policies in the migration and refugees file. Reached an agreement in a way that, okay, EU will pay the money and Greece try to solve the situation. And then the local government in Lesbos announced that there will be new closed camps so they can proceed and faster the asylum cases. And that make the local, like the Greek local people feel that it's not fair. Our country already faced what it's facing, and now this pandemic is coming. And for a long time, the refugee became a headache for the Greek islands. It started to be kind of a temporary stage for people reaching the islands and reaching Europe to study the asylum cases, decide on it. But now people are stuck there for more than 2 years just to have the first hearing. And let's say the EU member states who have the capacity and resources to welcome these people in their lands kind of withdrawn the responsibility. And then they used the pandemic to just say, okay, everything is not important now. We are facing a crisis. And for the first time that I thought that people will finally and actually feel literally the struggle or the feeling of someone that have uncertainty in their life. But in the opposite, they really took the advantage.
It's not just the Greece, it's not just Lesbos and what happened in Moria in March and how it was escalated, but also when we look in the central Mediterranean, a country of crisis like Italy closed their harbors and their borders and announced that and stated that it's not a safe place anymore because of what they are facing, because of Corona. And then again, Malta, and literally they pushed back people through the Libyan Coast Guard, what's called Coast Guards. And again, the lack of assistance, they left people to die at sea for days. The involvement of merchant vessels and the civil institutes and civil bodies helping to bring people back to Libya. There was a scandal actually during the season of Easter when people died, 40 people died because of lack of assistance, because they died starving at sea. Until this moment, there is no publicly, there is no, the communication between Italy and Malta is not public.
They said that, okay, there is a rescue mission going on, there is communication between 2 European member states, we are coordinating with the Libyan Coast Guards, we will not push back people to Libya, but what happened? People poured back and pushed back illegally to Libya through a merchant vessel, through a civil body, let's say, not a governmental one. And it's a scandal. And people died in the end. And everyone is just washing their hands from this responsibility.
The Maltese Prime Minister yesterday announced that it's, or stated that it's crucial to accept and welcome people crossing the sea, fleeing the war, looking for a safe place, but it's not acceptable that Malta become a gate to let Africa arrive into Europe. So there's a contradiction between the nice human rights talk and intro, and then the conclusion that you are closing the door in front of vulnerable people.
Yeah, so it's very clear that the pandemic serves as a strategic occasion for states to push back, as you said, and to do so in ways that might, in normal circumstances, be more difficult to do. And now the public just doesn't really react to this. I was wondering what you think are the mid or long-term consequences of this. So this is the kind of, in this moment, this is what is happening, and it's very worrying and scandalous. do you think this will, in the long term, sort of serve as a kind of precedent for states to engage in forms of migration control and repression that, in the pre-pandemic times were also there, but maybe not at the same kind of scale or with the same kind of brutality? So do you think this will have more long-term consequences?
To be honest, this is a long-term strategy. This is a long-term behavior. It's not from today or yesterday. This has been the old routine, like this pushback and securing the border and closing the border. But now, the pandemic is a kind of a legitimate excuse for the states to put more repression and close more borders, and they already have the excuse to the public. We are facing anonymous enemy. It's threatening the human beings. Yes, it's there, but it's not that. They exaggerated the situation to achieve, to really go faster, to achieve some plans and some aims and goals in the agenda. This agenda actually publicly and officially out since 2016. The EU migration, they call it migration crisis management. So it's out, and we are in 2020, and they are just want to achieve more in shorter time. And now the state, like the European states and EU, saying it's really clearly and loudly, we are working on not let these people arrive to Europe. That's like, we will not make them cross the Mediterranean. There is a lot of effort since ages to make a Mediterranean a kind of a border zone, not just a sea. It's a border zone between Asia, Africa, and Europe. And the EU, since a decade, at least a decade, and they are achieving a successful point in their eyes to externalize the border, to put the borders outside Europe. The European border is not just the front countries, but it's also North African countries. It's Turkey. It's West African countries in the Atlantic. This is kind of the borders now, the EU borders now.
I would like to hear from Manuela how she assesses against the longer-term functioning of the border regime the impact of the pandemic. So, I mean, you've worked on borders and migration, and your work has highlighted how borders always have a kind of selective function. So they're never purely closed. They always allow for some flows of people, of goods, etc. And this is part of the logic of borders. And I would be interested in your view of how the pandemic affects that logic. Did this logic change? Is it reclassified in some sense?
Yeah, thank you also for inviting me, and I'm very happy to join into this discussion. And while I was listening to you, I agree that with all the things or points that you make, and I think that at the same time, what I think will be really interesting to look at from a point in the future is that it's not just the pandemic, as you say, it's the measures taken in a situation that is called a situation which is, caused by a pandemic. So that means we can look at the measures, and we can look at what are the measures that have been taken vis-a-vis the pandemic. And what is not clear to me, and I think this can be something that could be solved in the future, is what exactly were the measures of closing borders vis-a-vis the threat of the virus. This was something that has never been clear to me. So there was a lot of, scholarly, scientifically proven or convincing arguments of measures, in my opinion, that were taken to actually really take care of the health situation. But then what was the logic of closing the border? And because it was clearly caused by mobility. the spread of the virus is an effect of a certain kind of mobility. But what kind of mobility? It seemed clear, for example, that people would return basically from skiing in the Alps who brought the virus. But these are not the refugees, of course, but the opposite, maybe a different, it was a different class-based mobility that was actually contributing to spreading the virus. This is something that has not been discussed at all, but which is interesting. And it affects, as you rightly said, people in a different way. So I think this is the first thing that I think would be interesting, and we will be possibly able to look at this in the future when we look at the measures that were taken and why they were taken as such. The second point that I think is relevant is that what we saw unfolding was once the borders were closed, it wasn't that mobility stopped at all, but there was actually a whole heterogeneity and a multiplication of mobilities in relation not only to the question of asylum and closing the borders for a particular group of people, but if you look at the borders, and you were asking about the functioning of the border, it's always a border regime, but it's also always a labor regime. And so what we saw at some point was that there was an openly discussed shortage of labor when it came to, for example, care professions, but also in terms of, for example, questions of harvesting asparagus and everything else. So we had the instance, for example, that a group of people were actually being flown in by the government to help out on this. But in general, there was an open discussion now that obviously the border wasn't only about humanitarian questions or the freedom of movement, but it was actually also about labor. So I think somehow, if we think what is it that we can discuss for the future, is that we can actually make a point out of this and make sure that the border regime is also a labor regime. And the third point that I think is really interesting is that what we observe now is a surprising way in which measures are taken and regulations are possible that we thought would have never been possible before. And one instance that is relevant, for example, to migrant population was that, for example, Portugal quite early decided that since, which is true in this respect, the virus doesn't discriminate in the way it, infects people, although, as you said, it's completely unequally distributed, how it affects it, right? What is interesting is that if you then take care that everyone has health provision, you better the situation, which meant that all the people who were undocumented in Portugal were actually documented at that point, or legalized, as we would say, and then provided health provisions. And so something was possible in that crisis that was impossible or was considered impossible before. And I think these instances are really interesting in terms of, not only speaking about how bad that situation was, but also actually if there was something that was, pointing to some sort of difference and more, based on more solidarity in society that we could actually take and use and say, okay, so let's think about this for the future, because if you are ill or you are ill, I may become ill too. So what does that mean for all of us living in a society independent of their status in terms of, citizenship, for example?
I mean, from what you say, there are 2 points maybe that we could talk a bit more about that I find extremely interesting. One is that, let's say, this gap between what a responsible reaction to the spread of the virus would be, and which has happened in some areas of public life, and the closing of borders suggests that this was a largely symbolic move, part of what some have called the border spectacle, meant to reassure populations that the government is in charge, rather than something that was really mandated by any kind of objective threat of migration being linked to the virus. As you said, that's these are not the migration flows that were at all in question when you try to trace how the virus spread all over the world. These were different types of mobility regimes that were at stake there. So I think this question of symbolic border politics, the border spectacle, clearly plays a role there. And Seehofer, the German Interior Minister himself, admitted that the experts actually told him that it doesn't make any sense to close the borders in this way. And still, he wanted to do it in order to be the strong man who assures everyone that the government is taking good care of German citizens. And there one could become quite nervous and think, okay, if it works that way, what is the implication for that kind of politics in the future? The second point relates to this link between the border regime and the labor regime, which I think is also extremely important. I mean, one way it struck me in the whole discussion about, especially in the case of cheap migrant labor for the harvesting season, there seemed to be a shared assumption, as it were, in the background, namely that both the lives of refugees now at stake in the EU border camps, which were in a catastrophic situation before, but even worse through the pandemic, and the lives of those who are flown in to pick the German asparagus, were basically regarded as disposable lives, as lives that don't have the same kind of value that is attached to the lives that the government tries to save by getting all these programs rolling in response to the pandemic. So in the end, the lives of refugees in the camps didn't matter that much. Otherwise, something would have happened. Some more responsibility would have been taken. But neither did the lives of the cheap migrant labor that is flown in to pick the asparagus, because they were working under conditions that were clearly health hazards and not in line with how the pandemic was supposed to be, not with the health guidelines of the government. So I was wondering, do you want to speak a bit more about these two aspects, the border spectacle and this kind of disposability of life that seems to return in both the case of the refugees and the case of migrant labor?
Sure. So the border spectacle is something that I think, is also been an ambivalent question even to governments. I mean, if you think about the law and order practices that, for example, Trump now performs in an incredible way. I mean, he's been the one who's tried to blame the pandemic on, the Chinese, and speaking of a foreign virus, which was particularly a point where you can say, well, he wasn't making a point about migration here. He was making a geopolitical point about, changing the changing, landscape of capitalist production and reproduction, and how geopolitics changed between the US and China at this point. So there are many factors coming in, I think, that are relevant and interesting to look at. But the border scenario also was played out by Viktor Orban in Hungary, where he would, use, I think it was a couple of foreign students who had to leave the country, and it was made such a spectacle case. Well, as in Germany, it was the other way around. There wasn't much hatred and racism expressed, as far as I was observing, and it wasn't particularly strong. It wasn't a particularly strong point for a political right here. They were not really making, or not really able to make a point in terms of racism that they had before. But at the same time, we could see exactly this this migration and labor regime coming in when they were people were invited as harvesters, but people also, for example, which was a big issue in terms of the meat industry in Germany, and where we had not only the situation of refugee camps where there was a spreading of the virus, but also camps of workers in the meat industries who were living under unacceptable conditions, and where the virus also spread. So we could say that the disposability of life and labor has become at stake at this point in the last few weeks and months, which are highly ambivalent, and not just in one way, because there was an opportunity to speak, for example, about the precarious situation of labor or work in more general, but what is clear and what is often not discussed is that this precarity is something to do with a migration regime which for different people plays out differently, because what is at stake for them differently than for others is not only the precarity of their life and their ability to work or not work or have to work, and but also their ability to stay in a place and the conditions that they have to accept to take up certain forms of work. So I think this mixture is something that then that doesn't have this wasn't really discussed a lot, this particular connection.
Yeah, I mean, in more visibly in some countries than in others, this overlaps, I guess, right? I mean, especially if you look at the Italian and Spanish agricultural sectors, a lot of refugees and undocumented migrants are employed there under quite horrible conditions. So the two problematics that we've been talking about intersect in these cases. I was wondering whether you have a perspective on what is happening to refugees and undocumented migrants in these contexts in particular.
I have in mind the situation when we have migrant and asylum seekers in move trying to reach Europe, and they got rescued in the Mediterranean and then stayed over 40 days kind of detained and locked down in a ship. No place to go. And at the same time, I know people who work in the sealing industry, like ships and fishing ports, and also these people were locked down at sea in the ship for more than 2-3 weeks, and then you reach a port to stay in a quarantine. But for refugees and asylum, no. And when we take the example of Portugal and how they made something was impossible to happen during this time, I would say there's always a possibility, but it's all about the intention. If there is a political intention to decide to include and integrate these communities and these migrants into the society. I always say that the documents are just papers issued by a state, and if it's the state have the intention and the resources and the capacity to decide to issue this kind of paper for someone in need, they will do it.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely important point, that there's always this moment of political decision, and that cases like the one in Portugal show that, it's not predetermined, but there is political decision space, which means also that there's political responsibility. And I mean, I was wondering how that, responsibility and making people responsible in a way and forcing certain decisions maybe links to the fact that both in terms of migration, the border regime, but also the question of labor, there are always struggles around these issues, right? I mean, they're not just structural features of our social reality that are somehow stable or follow their own logic, but they're always tied to social and political struggles involving, also struggles by refugees and migrants. And I would be very interested in your perspective on the role of struggles in this context, both, let's say, more generally, but also maybe with regard to questions such as, well, how do governments react under the conditions of the pandemic, and what are the perspectives and the possibilities of struggles to make certain reactions maybe more likely than others?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, because there's not very much consistency overall in migration policies, and that is the confusing thing. So what we shouldn't do is bring in too much consistency and too much intention, because then we overestimate what is actually done. But what we see is a very heterogeneous landscape of policies here and there. They contradict each other, and they don't only contradict each other's in terms, but also in time. So, and then in a situation of crisis, of course, there are different measures being taken for different, rationales, basically. And so the labor question is interesting in this respect because sometimes the question of precariousness is a socially or a general felt one, in which at the same time, in the same way as the undocumented in terms of migration laws, there is undocumented labor. Yeah, and I'm not only speaking about undocumented labor by people who do not have documentation to stay in a country, but for ordinary citizens. So there's a connection of undocumentedness here, and it seems, although we don't have much numbers on this, that this undocumentedness, meaning the precarity of life and labor, is rising. It's becoming more relevant for our societies. So what does that mean if we always consider and take into account that there is no such thing as labor without mobility? It doesn't exist. Historically, it's always been connected. So that means that if we speak about the migrant, if we speak about the mobility of populations, we also always speak about labor, and we speak about its mobility, and we speak about mobile labor, because even if people are mobile and they're called the refugees, at some point they will have to earn money. They will have to, sell workforce, do something to provide an income, and even as basic as it is. So that means it's always connected to that question. And so how people are integrated in a society always connects to not only the question of labor rights or to mobility rights, but also then to social rights. And these three categories interlink, and they give an incredibly complicated landscape of accesses and to rights and disenfranchisement. So, for example, a colleague who's a legal scholar, she once pointed out that only in Germany, and this is years ago, and I don't know how it is now, if you connect questions of residence permissions with social rights, you get around 71 different legal statutes. Okay, so it doesn't mean that the classical categories that the border regime actually generates, like the undocumented and the asylum seeker, and the person who has a right to stay for a year and longer and forever, etc., all these categories, they are then also interlinked with the question of accessing social rights, and that makes it completely complicated. And then, if I may add one more thing, is that the whole discourse around migration is a problem as such, because there is a perception, an idea that sealing of borders is still a way, and controlling is a way to organize mobility in our societies. And there has been a very, very little opening of that after 2015, where even the German government began to think that maybe sealing of borders in a highly globalized world may not be a useful concept anymore. But I don't see any social discussion around the question. So if we have closed borders, and if this is not a concept for the 21st century, how do we then have to open them in relation to labor, social, and mobility rights for a future society that would be based on basic ideas of solidarity?
Yeah, maybe that's a good moment to talk a bit more about these prospects for solidarity that might arise in the current situation, either based on this kind of more long-term dynamics that you, Manuela, just pointed to, or maybe also based on what Kashef mentioned at the beginning, namely this idea that you said, well, this could be a moment, or it could have been a moment where people experience a level of uncertainty, vulnerability, and precarity that they're usually, in these privileged contexts in which we live here in Germany, for example, shielded from. But now they experience it to a certain extent, and this might have triggered some empathy, let's say, with people who live under these conditions of increased and extreme vulnerability and precarity and uncertainty like refugees, it could have been a basis for solidarity. It could have been a basis for a different, let's say, political relation to the question of borders, of refugees, etc. But this is not what is happening, it seems, right? So I was wondering whether you could talk a bit more about how you think this potential for solidarity, how we should think about it, how it might be realized, and yeah, whether you think that there could be such a shared basis, let's say, for solidarity in this moment.
For me, the solidarity, the point of solidarity, comes when I'm aware about my rights and others' rights, and to know that it's them today and me tomorrow. For example, that we see this demo and mobilization around Black Lives Matter, and that because the people they felt the empathy with this individual case, with someone in a country over the seas, or because that they are in solidarity with the people that facing the same behavior inside Europe or inside the one country. So we are, when I say that I'm in solidarity with someone in the other side of the Mediterranean, what that means and what that needs me to do. So it's a difficult question to really find out how to be in solidarity.
Well, I think what you said points at least to a kind of minimum that one would have to do. I mean, it's clearly not enough to declare solidarity, and now with the protests that you pointed to, sometimes one can get the impression that it's quite easy for some Germans to go demonstrate and to declare their solidarity with African Americans in the US. But at the same time, it seems much more difficult for them to understand that some of these problems affect people of color in Germany as well, and that they should also look inside to a certain extent, not just across the Atlantic. So this seems like a minimum condition of solidarity. It can't just be an abstract declaration. It has to have concrete practical effects, and it has to relate to changing one's own behavior, one's own political activism, maybe one's own political thinking in the context in which one is inserted. Before we maybe talk a bit more about solidarity as a category and how it might be rethought under current conditions, I just wanted to ask you again, Kashef, because you're also engaged in some very concrete projects that have to do with solidarity and with humanitarian help, how your own work as an activist and with the alarm phone, how you think about that work under these in these conditions, but also with relation to these categories: solidarity, help, humanitarianism. Could you speak a bit about that?
So when it comes concretely to the project in solidarity with refugees and migrant and people in move, I would say that the simple form of solidarity is to represent their struggles, their crisis, to represent their voices, to try to give them a platform to represent themselves, to talk for themselves. And yeah, I think for example, the alarm phone as a project, as a hotline, just simple like that, vulnerable people in distress call in alarm phone to be a kind of a mediator or representative with the authority, to provide information to public. I think this is solidarity when I spread a word or try to acknowledge this struggle. You have a task to update yourself, to educate yourself, to try to open a discussion with someone that you share the same, let's say, the same background or similar background. It's useful just to discuss with people, to listen to them.
So I guess this would be another minimal condition of solidarity, that there's actually some kind of exchange and some kind of, let's say, symmetry between the positions, not just a complete misrecognition or exclusion of the other position. One has to at least hear and try to represent, as you said, or let speak for themselves those who have certain experiences. Otherwise, it will just be a rhetorical declaration. So, I mean, one way in which solidarity did come up in the pandemic is obviously in this kind of very simple communitarian form of an appeal to the national we, to everyone's responsibility. There was this phenomenon of disaster nationalism. So a catastrophe is afflicting us, let's close the border and take care of ourselves. That seems to have been the immediate impulse of a lot of people and governments. Closing the borders was one reaction that came out of this. What do you think, Manuela, about prospects of solidarity beyond this kind of communitarian nationalistic framework? Is there, for you, any perspective towards transnational solidarity that could emerge out of the current constellation?
Yeah. Well, you know, the first point, I think I've made this before. So there's this sort of nationalism in there, but also it's a different kind of nationalism than we have when we have other discussions. It meant that within that national framework, there was at least a sense that everyone should have access to a certain form of health provision. It was, at least discursively, not distributed unequally. It wasn't said, so certain people should and others shouldn't. There was an idea that everyone should have that, you know, provision, because it actually affects everyone. And if it's unequally distributed, it may affect even the wrong people or the right people. So even when we speak of that nationalism, we have to say that it's a different kind of nationalism, in the quality that there was an idea that even like everyone who was here should have that. But that's only a normative idea, you know. But still, it's you know, it's helpful, and it's a difference to other forms of nationalism where there is a clear understanding that there's only one, and this is the people who have a German citizenship, that, you know, in general should be granted this and that right. I think this is one thing. The other thing is that I think that migration as such is precisely a point where we always discuss the question of transnational solidarity, because it always is relating to a population that is not considered the one that is part of one territory, but it's a mobile one, or it's one that is moving from place A to B. And so what do we do? You know, so, and since this is a general feature of our societies today, we have to ask that question from the point of solidarity in the same way that it has been solved before. And and obviously the solution to provide the basic ideas of solidarity only to one group that is considered, for example, German, or in different territories, and they have different ideas about who the people are who are granted these rights. We have to think about how, in a highly mobile world, we can actually extend these rights. Sometimes temporarily, sometimes permanently. But how do we exactly do this, and how do we relate this to the other aspects of rights that I've mentioned before? So this is labor, social, and citizenship rights in general. But then, you know, if we speak about these questions of solidarity, then this is not only a question of regulation, it's not only a question of citizenship, it's also a question of, you know, the very conditions of why people actually leave places. And why do they have to seek for labor elsewhere or for work elsewhere and sell their workforce? Why, why is it that there's war in certain places? Why is it that there is, a climate catastrophe happening, etc., etc.? So the questions become really complex in a world, affected by in a situation where, the existence of of humanity has been questioned in general. So how do we do this? And definitely the answer, and I think this is something that we all know, cannot lie in a national confined concept. This is impossible. So the future of solidarity has to be one that is transnational per se, but then there's a lot of questions that arise from it. And I think we spoke about a couple of them, and we can definitely, allocate them in the question of migration, but we have to ask them also in the way, how our economy is organized, for example.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our discussion, but I wanted to follow up on Manuela's last point and ask about the future prospects of solidarity in this kind of transnational register, because I agree on the one hand, the structural conditions and challenges are such that only transnational type of solidarity could provide an answer to it. The kind of closing nationalist discourse does not, provide an adequate response to these objective challenges and the crises that beset us. At the same time, of course, if we look around us, we don't only have to look at the US and Brazil and Turkey and other places. We can look in Europe, UK, Germany as well. There are very strong political forces, sometimes in power, which don't go that way, which are still advancing the discourse and the practice of closure, of exclusion, etc. So I wonder how this kind of, the pressure of the situation towards a transnational perspective and the kind of regressive tendencies that go very much in the direction of closure and nationalism, well, where that leaves us with regard to the prospect of solidarity in the future. Kashef, would you like to?
We need to be kind of productive or creative to find a new forum of solidarities. For example, we could organize a transnational event at the same time, in the same day, in different cities around, not just around Europe, but around let's say the Mediterranean. And again, yesterday, Germany as a state was announced that they will extend the closure of borders for non-European citizens until the end of August. And it's not just affecting refugees and labor migrants, but also affecting let's say the people in the system themselves, like the families who waiting for years for family reunification, and then the pandemic came, the pandemic season I call it, came to stop and hold all the process and to put all the process on hold. What that means for them, how could I come in solidarity, because this is actually a direct affection of the closure. So actually, I'm all the time just trying to avoid the talking about nationalism, because for me it's beyond that. If we want to talk real talks here, we are living a global capital system who likes to divide the societies and countries in markets. So we are living in market. In a big market, and every such a nation has its own market and its own section. So when the nationalists talk about nation and the nationalism, identity and ideals, for me, it just the picture of a market, and I'm stuck in one section and cannot go for other to keep the social distance of 2 meters, and the market is so crowded and everything is getting expensive, and we cannot actually accept someone coming from outside the market to share the goods with us, because it's here just enough for us.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that you would refuse speaking about it, about nationalism, because it's, if I get you right, you say, this cannot and will not be the horizon of how we find solutions to the pertinent problems that we all face. as mankind or in particular local situation, both at the same time and in different, and being disposed to it in very different ways. So that's an interesting point. So let's, disregard that for a moment and say, okay, the national framework is not the one. We will still, and I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. We need to take into account that there is an option that even if we all feel there is no solution, if we speak about it in that particular way, that this will still become the modes of existence for all of us. And then the way people are posing questions will remain in this very confined way that you have been addressing. So the question is, how do we get rid of these horizons and frameworks? Which kind of questions do we have to pose to actually, and what are we actually, in which questions are we actually able to pose in a way that will help us towards answers or responses or certain forms of lives or ways of lives that will provide practices from which we can grow new ways of solidarity in these transnational respects. And I think there are already many, but we would need another session to actually elaborate on this. But I think you are absolutely right to say, let's get rid of a certain confinement of discussion to be actually able to think out of the box, because the question you are asking is something that is so challenging, but also something that we can't escape anymore. I think that's also the sense that we all have. If we continue to let us be confined in these questions, we will not come up with a solution, but that feels like something that has become existential to all of us.
Just to clarify, I'm not refusing, I'm avoiding and trying to ignore it, because as you said, there is no horizon. So for me, it's just a waste of time to keep turning around in the same circle.
I agree, absolutely, because then, we completely end up talking about these issues all the times. And yeah, it seems like a waste of time, and it also seems we don't have so much time anymore.
So yeah, I think we share the hope and also the sense of urgency that the, let's say, fact of connectedness and the fact of, let's say, plurality and heterogeneity in that connectedness and the challenges that are coming with it, that these will give rise to, let's say, new forms of solidarity. The ones that you were describing might serve as a starting point for that. But yeah, there's a big political project ahead, I think, given these sort of structural conundrums that we've been discussing. Let's hope we can continue the conversation at some point and look at some of these possible avenues for the future in more detail. But I would really like to thank you both, Kashef and Manuela, for contributing to charting the territory and getting a better sense of what is at stake in the current situation. So thanks a lot, and hopefully till soon.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thanks for the time and having me here.